The grand banquet hall was filled with echoing laughter while every single guest turned their complete attention toward the brightly lit center stage where the main attraction of the evening was currently standing. My brother stood tall with a microphone in his hand, while projecting an incredibly smug tone across the room to announce that he would purchase a luxurious apartment tomorrow morning as the ultimate surprise gift for our parents. Immediately after making that grandiose promise, he directed a mocking glare straight at my corner table before speaking directly into the microphone. He smiled arrogantly while declaring, "Look at the great freeloader of our family, she has nothing but failure." I remained perfectly still in my secluded seat while offering a polite smile to the crowd, calmly sipping my red wine without showing a single trace of anger because I was the only person who knew the devastating truth. The reality was that I had completely emptied the shared funding accounts, while securely locking every single credit card exactly 1 week prior to this event, meaning his glorious vision of wealth was destined to collapse into absolute ruin by the very next morning. Before I explain how a supposed failure managed to orchestrate this total financial collapse, please hit that subscribe button and like this video so you never miss out on any of our upcoming dramatic stories. Throughout my entire childhood growing up under that roof in Spokane, I always felt like a completely superfluous existence within my own family. I was born into a household where every ounce of affection and all available financial resources were unfairly funneled by my mother Linda and my father Charles directly toward my brother Preston. They treated him like a pristine investment that required constant nurturing while treating me like an afterthought who merely consumed their oxygen. Every family dinner conversation revolved entirely around his minor achievements, while my own significant academic milestones were quickly dismissed with a careless nod before the topic shifted back to his future prospects. I learned to navigate my youth by staying out of the way and observing how easily money dictated the flow of love in our household. Preston constantly weaponized that extreme parental favoritism to deliberately trample on my self-esteem whenever he saw an opportunity to elevate himself at my expense. He would mock my career aspirations during holiday gatherings while making sure everyone in the room heard his biting insults. Instead of correcting his toxic behavior, Mom and Dad simply watched from the sidelines, while actively praising his vicious arrogance as a necessary leadership trait for a highly successful businessman. They honestly believed his cruel remarks were simply manifestations of a competitive spirit that would eventually lead him to greatness in the corporate world. It became glaringly obvious that compassion was considered a weakness under their roof, while ruthlessness was rewarded with endless praise and financial backing. Recognizing very early on that I would never have a respected voice or a safe space in that toxic environment, I made the firm decision to pack my belongings and relocate to Seattle immediately after finishing my education to forge my own independent path. I intentionally severed all my emotional dependencies on them while making a silent vow to myself that I would never accept a single penny of financial support from my parents ever again. I wanted to prove that I could survive and thrive entirely on my own merits without owing them any gratitude or falling victim to their manipulative control tactics. The geographical distance finally provided me with the mental clarity I desperately needed to focus entirely on my professional ambitions without their constant belittling voices echoing in my mind. Enduring countless sleepless nights and surviving fierce struggles within the highly competitive corporate landscape, I systematically built my own massive business empire from the ground up through sheer determination. I successfully accumulated vast amounts of wealth through calculated investments and relentless hard work over the span of a decade. My company eventually grew into a dominant force within the industry, securing multi-million-dollar contracts that firmly established my position as a respected corporate leader. However, I made the conscious choice to keep my massive financial success an absolute secret from everyone back in my hometown, because I knew exactly how their greed would manifest if they ever discovered the truth about my net worth. Whenever they formally summoned me back home for their mandatory family gatherings, I intentionally maintained an incredibly simple lifestyle to avoid drawing any unwanted attention to my actual financial status. I would deliberately wear my most ordinary discount clothing and drive an older economy vehicle just to keep up the carefully crafted illusion of mediocrity. I would sit quietly at their extravagant dinner tables while listening to them brag about their minor financial victories, never once mentioning the lucrative corporate acquisitions I had finalized just hours prior. Those calculated choices allowed my family to comfortably continue believing that I was still a pathetic failure who was desperately struggling to make ends meet in the unforgiving big city. 2 weeks before the anniversary party, a rapid sequence of unexpected events completely exposed the elaborate web of lies surrounding my family. I received a brief and remarkably cold telephone call from my parents, solely to inform me about the logistical details of their upcoming celebration, without offering any pleasantries. They recited the formal schedule and venue location with a transactional efficiency that left absolutely no room for any genuine warmth or parental affection toward their own daughter. During that entire frustrating conversation, neither mom nor dad bothered to ask a single question about my personal life or my current well-being living alone in Seattle. They simply demanded my obedient attendance to fill a chair and maintain the fragile public illusion of a happy family gathering for their wealthy suburban guests. Almost immediately after that dismissive conversation ended, Preston called my personal number using his familiar condescending tone that always dripped with unearned superiority. He wasted absolutely no time before loudly mocking my supposed financial struggles, while sarcastically asking if I had managed to scrape together enough spare change to afford a decent gift for our parents on this monumental occasion. He spoke with the absolute certainty of a man who firmly believed he was standing on top of the corporate world while looking down at a pathetic failure who barely deserved his valuable attention. He did not even pause to let me formulate a response before eagerly launching into a grandiose monologue about his own magnificent financial plans for the upcoming anniversary celebration. His voice swelled with obnoxious pride as he practically shouted his grand scheme through the receiver to ensure I fully grasped the magnitude of his supposed massive wealth. He laughed arrogantly into the receiver before declaring, "I am going to buy a luxurious house in the wealthiest neighborhood for them, so you just prepare to open your eyes and watch my triumph." I chose to maintain absolute silence in the face of his overwhelming arrogance, because engaging in a petty sibling argument would only feed his desperate need for constant validation. Listening to him desperately trying to crush my spirit only reinforced my firm decision to remain entirely emotionally detached from his pathetic competitive games. I took a slow breath to center myself before coldly replying, "Just do whatever you think is right." I immediately ended the call without bothering to utter another syllable or waiting to hear his inevitable sarcastic rebuttal. Right as I placed my cell phone back onto my polished wooden desk, my secretary Sarah stepped into my private office holding a massive stack of confidential financial portfolios. She approached my workspace with a highly serious professional demeanor while explaining that these thick documents contained desperate pleas for emergency capital injections from various struggling enterprises. These were all failing companies actively searching for a massive financial lifeline to avoid total structural ruin in a highly volatile corporate market that showed absolutely no mercy to incompetent management teams. I casually flipped through the organized executive summaries while drinking my morning coffee, until my eyes suddenly locked onto a remarkably familiar corporate logo printed on a red folder. I sat there in complete stunned silence as I stared directly at the official legal name of Preston's supposedly thriving company, sitting prominently on a distressed asset list awaiting immediate liquidation. The confidential financial audit clearly indicated that his business was aggressively hemorrhaging money and teetering on the absolute brink of an unrecoverable bankruptcy. That devastating documented reality stood in absolute stark contrast to the obnoxiously self-satisfied bragging he had just projected over the phone mere minutes earlier. 1 week after that deeply insulting telephone call regarding the upcoming anniversary party, the undeniable evidence of Preston's absolute corporate corruption rested neatly in a thick stack upon my polished office desk, proving exactly how hollow his arrogant boasting truly was. Through an incredibly thorough and highly confidential forensic audit initiated by my private financial team, the shocking truth regarding his rapidly collapsing business empire finally came to light in spectacular fashion. I discovered that Preston had been continuously embezzling substantial corporate funds for several consecutive years to artificially inflate his personal wealth behind the backs of his shareholders. He was desperately siphoning out massive amounts of operating capital solely to finance a ridiculously flashy and luxurious lifestyle, alongside his equally parasitic spouse, my sister-in-law Kendra. They were essentially funding their endless luxury vacations and expensive designer wardrobes by aggressively bleeding his struggling company completely dry while simultaneously lying to their desperate investors. The absolute worst revelation hidden within those horrifying financial documents was finding concrete proof that he was actively forging official signatures on banking authorization forms to access restricted capital. He was systematically preparing to secretly drain a highly confidential joint credit fund that I had personally established specifically to cover any future medical emergencies for Mom and Dad. He possessed absolutely no shame about stealing an emergency medical safety net just to fund his pathetic real estate illusion and maintain his fake societal status among his wealthy peers. After thoroughly reviewing these disgusting financial maneuvers, my best friend and lawyer, Monica, forcefully slammed the heavy evidence folder down onto my glass conference table with visible disgust radiating from her expression. She crossed her arms tightly while glaring fiercely at the falsified signature pages before speaking with a tone overflowing with righteous indignation on my behalf. She shook her head in sheer disbelief at the sheer audacity of his predatory actions before asking, "They really treat you as nothing more than an ATM? Are you going to just let this go?" I looked back at her with entirely cold eyes while slowly turning each individual page of the damning bank statements without showing a single ounce of hesitation or lingering regret. The final traces of familial obligation completely evaporated from my mind as I meticulously reviewed the undeniable proof of his intended financial betrayal against my private accounts. I maintained an absolutely steady gaze while coldly replying to her entirely justified concern about my next move. I will show him exactly what the consequences are for touching my money. Taking immediate and incredibly decisive action, I firmly instructed my wealth management team to completely withdraw every single penny from that compromised joint medical fund before the banks closed for the day. I then contacted the major financial institutions to permanently freeze all related credit cards associated with that specific account, to thoroughly dismantle his fake house buying scheme before it could even materialize. There would be absolutely no available capital remaining in those accounts when he inevitably attempted to swipe those useless plastic cards at the real estate agency the following morning. Simultaneously executing the final phase of my retribution strategy, Monica utilized a heavily obscured corporate shell company to legally purchase all of Preston's distressed corporate debt from his panicked lenders at a mere fraction of the original cost. We then moved swiftly in the financial shadows to quietly accumulate the massive blocks of voting shares that his terrified board of directors were frantically selling off to escape the impending corporate bankruptcy. By the time Friday afternoon finally rolled around, I secretly possessed absolute controlling power over the very business empire he used to constantly justify his insufferable arrogance. On the night of the anniversary party in Spokane, the grand banquet hall was overflowing with glittering lights alongside the boisterous laughter of the invited guests mingling near the bar. I entered the venue entirely unnoticed, like an invisible ghost navigating through the wealthy crowd, before quietly taking my assigned seat at a highly obscured corner table near the kitchen doors. Meanwhile, Preston and Kendra were completely surrounded by a massive flock of eager attendees who were showering them with overwhelmingly fake flattery that echoed throughout the entire room. They soaked up the superficial admiration with greedy smiles while actively ignoring my quiet arrival at the back of the elegant dining area because they were too busy basking in their fake glory. The exact moment Preston stepped up onto the decorated podium to deliver his highly anticipated toast, he immediately launched into an incredibly pretentious speech designed entirely to stroke his own massive ego. He masterfully manipulated his words to paint himself as the ultimate savior of our family lineage, before grandly announcing his intention to purchase an outrageously expensive house for our aging parents. His voice boomed across the silent room as he practically demanded a standing ovation for a wildly generous financial commitment that he was fundamentally incapable of actually fulfilling without access to my restricted capital. Pausing his dramatic monologue for theatrical effect, he deliberately directed a look of absolute disdain toward my shadowy corner to publicly humiliate me in front of the massive, attentive crowd. He utilized his captive audience to hurl stinging insults regarding my supposed financial failures, while ensuring every single guest understood exactly how little he respected my continued existence. Instead of stepping in to protect their own daughter from this completely unprovoked verbal assault, Mom and Dad simply smiled with overwhelming pride at their wealthy son. They looked genuinely thrilled by his display of dominance without showing a single ounce of parental concern for the vicious public degradation I was currently enduring. An older female guest sitting right next to me leaned over with a deeply pitying expression painted across her wrinkled face while quietly observing the ongoing spectacle on the main stage. She shook her head sympathetically before leaning closer to my ear to whisper her completely unsolicited judgment regarding my perceived inferior status within the strict family hierarchy. She sighed heavily while staring at my plain outfit before stating, "It is truly a pity that you cannot be even a fraction as successful as your brother, because this family clearly can only rely on him." I gently raised my crystal wine glass to my lips while offering the judgmental woman a perfectly calm smile that completely masked the absolute financial destruction waiting in the upcoming shadows. I looked directly into her condescending eyes while casually taking a slow sip of the expensive red vintage without letting Preston's pathetic theatrical performance break my steady composure. Maintaining an aura of absolute tranquility amidst the ongoing humiliation echoing across the room, I softly replied, "Sometimes the most glittering things are the easiest to shatter when the sun finally rises." Instead of exploding into a fit of predictable anger or breaking down into pathetic tears, like they probably expected, I simply placed the half-empty glass back onto the pristine white tablecloth. I slowly stood up from my secluded chair while brushing the invisible dust from my simple outfit to prepare for my quiet departure from the suffocatingly toxic environment. I walked out of the echoing banquet hall in complete silence, while firmly telling myself that this ridiculous theatrical production had officially reached its inevitable conclusion. The sickeningly sweet applause for Preston's fake generosity faded entirely behind the heavy wooden doors as I stepped out into the cool night air to await tomorrow's beautiful catastrophe. Exactly at 9 o'clock the following morning, the perfectly crafted mask Preston wore so proudly was officially torn apart inside the incredibly luxurious downtown real estate agency. Preston escorted Mom and Dad into the high-end brokerage office with an overwhelmingly arrogant demeanor that practically demanded immediate subservience from the administrative staff. He strutted purposefully toward the polished marble counter while speaking loudly about his massive wealth, radiating a completely unearned confidence as he prepared to finalize the paperwork. He casually pulled out the premium credit card to process the massive financial deposit for the wildly expensive property he had publicly promised them the night before. The digital payment terminal continuously flashed angry red error messages while firmly declining every single transaction attempt he desperately initiated under the watchful eyes of the gathered staff. Refusing to accept the embarrassing public rejection, he aggressively demanded that the receptionist contact the banking institution directly to resolve what he arrogantly claimed was a ridiculous technical glitch. A remarkably cold customer service representative over the speakerphone subsequently informed him that the primary account holder had completely emptied the funds and securely locked every connected card exactly 1 week ago. The automated voice effectively confirmed that his supposed bottomless well of wealth was entirely non-existent, leaving him staring blankly at the useless piece of plastic trembling in his hand. The senior real estate agent stared intensely at his visibly shaking hands with deep suspicion before decisively stepping back from the useless financial documents scattered across the pristine desk. The seasoned broker had clearly witnessed similar pathetic displays of fake wealth before and wasted absolutely no time putting an end to the ridiculous charade unfolding in the lobby. Maintaining a highly professional yet incredibly blunt tone that cut through the tense silence, the agent formally addressed the humiliating situation directly. "I am sorry, sir. Your card cannot complete the transaction, so we are forced to cancel this house purchase contract immediately." While heavy beads of cold sweat were rapidly forming across his forehead and dripping onto his expensive collar, his cell phone suddenly erupted with an urgent incoming call. He answered the device with trembling fingers only to hear his frantic corporate executives delivering a series of catastrophic updates regarding the fragile state of his crumbling business empire. The panicked voice on the other end delivered the absolutely devastating news that their final remaining investors had officially fled the sinking business to avoid catastrophic financial ruin. Furthermore, the terrified executive revealed that a completely anonymous entity had successfully executed a total corporate takeover by acquiring all their distressed debt during the early morning trading hours. Completely losing whatever fragile composure he still possessed in front of the stunned office workers, he gripped the mobile device tightly while his face flushed with uncontainable rage. The devastating realization that his entire fabricated existence was evaporating before his very eyes caused him to completely abandon any lingering sense of public decency or professional decorum. He screamed desperately into the receiver with a tone of absolute panic that echoed loudly throughout the quiet agency lobby. "What do you mean, who bought my company? You absolutely cannot do this because I am the director." Mom and Dad stood completely frozen in absolute horror near the entrance as the horrific reality of his massive financial deception finally shattered their deeply ingrained delusions. Their faces burned bright red with overwhelming shame after witnessing the undisputed golden child of the family being so disastrously exposed as a pathetic fraud in a public setting. Unable to endure the burning stares of the disgusted agency staff any longer, the deeply humiliated trio hastily fled the upscale brokerage firm in the most absolute disgrace imaginable. Later that same afternoon, I confidently strode through the reinforced glass doors of the corporate headquarters accompanied by my incredibly formidable legal team to finalize the destruction of his fake empire. Monica and I marched directly into the expansive main conference room where Preston was currently tearing at his hair in absolute financial despair while staring blankly at his plunging stock charts. My sudden and completely uninvited appearance inside his private executive sanctuary caused him to freeze in utter disbelief for several highly tense seconds before a massive wave of uncontrollable fury visibly consumed his entire trembling body. He simply could not comprehend why the sister he had always considered a pathetic loser was currently standing inside his boardroom. He aggressively slammed both of his fists down onto the polished mahogany table while violently rising to his feet with an incredibly distorted expression of pure, unadulterated rage. He desperately attempted to project his usual unwarranted authority over the increasingly chaotic situation by screaming at the top of his lungs while his face turned an angry shade of purple. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face while demanding immediate obedience from the frightened employees gathered in the hallway. "What the hell are you doing here? Security, drag this failure out of my company immediately." Absolutely. Not a single security guard dared to step forward or follow his frantic commands, because my legal team had already thoroughly briefed the building management regarding the massive change in corporate leadership. Monica stepped to the front of the room with an aura of absolute professional ice, while forcefully throwing the thick stack of finalized takeover documents directly onto the center of the wooden table. She glared fiercely at his pathetic display of desperation before delivering the ultimate reality check with a devastatingly firm tone that echoed through the silent room. "Look closely at these documents because this is no longer your company." The brutal and completely undeniable truth crashed down upon him like a massive iron sledgehammer as his trembling hands slowly flipped through the legally binding acquisition contracts scattered across the table. A look of sheer terrifying horror completely washed over his suddenly pale face as he finally processed the indisputable legal signatures, confirming the completely hostile takeover of his entire business empire. He stood completely paralyzed behind his former executive chair while realizing that the exact same sister he had publicly trampled upon just last night was now the supreme owner holding absolute power over his corporate survival. I stepped closer to the edge of the conference table and stared directly into his widely dilated eyes that were now completely overflowing with genuine paralyzing terror. I refused to offer him even a single ounce of familial pity or forgiveness after the decades of endless psychological abuse he had gleefully inflicted upon me for his own selfish amusement. I articulated every single syllable with absolute lethal precision to ensure he fully comprehended the severe gravity of his new reality. "Now pack your personal belongings and get out of my building before I call the police to throw you out." Completely stripped of all his manufactured pride and stolen corporate power, Preston physically slumped his shoulders in absolute devastating defeat, without daring to utter another arrogant word in my presence. He silently gathered his pathetic collection of personal desk items into a small brown cardboard box, while my newly appointed security personnel closely monitored his every single pathetic movement to ensure strict compliance. He was unceremoniously escorted out of the exact same prestigious corporate building he had actively used to build his fraudulent illusions of superiority, leaving behind nothing but a pathetic legacy of absolute financial failure. Over the following weeks, the real storm finally began to devastate whatever remained of my so-called family back in my former hometown. The brutally realistic consequences of his massive financial deception arrived with absolute devastating force to permanently destroy the incredibly arrogant existence he had falsely built. Preston not only permanently lost his prestigious corporate position under my new ownership, but he also faced incredibly serious criminal charges and potential jail time for actively embezzling company funds to finance his personal luxuries. Furthermore, Kendra immediately packed her designer bags and filed for a highly contentious divorce because she absolutely refused to endure the crushing weight of his newly acquired monumental debts or support a man heading to prison. Mom and Dad experienced a completely catastrophic emotional breakdown when their precious lifelong delusions regarding their wonderfully successful son were violently shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Without my secret emergency medical fund to rely upon, they were ultimately forced to sell the very same suburban house they had comfortably lived in for decades, just to desperately pay off a small fraction of his pathetic financial mistakes. They suddenly found themselves facing a harsh reality where their heavily favored child had actively ruined their golden retirement years through his uncontrollable greed. They continuously flooded my personal voicemail with dozens of desperate audio messages while sobbing uncontrollably to beg for my immediate financial assistance to save their rapidly sinking ship. They desperately tried to invoke feelings of familial guilt by constantly reminding me of our shared bloodline, completely ignoring the decades of psychological abuse they had happily allowed. I simply listened to their pathetic pleas, one final time in absolute silence, before permanently changing my personal phone number to coldly sever all remaining contact with them for the rest of my life. I comfortably returned to my peaceful life in Seattle to continue expanding my successful corporate empire with an entirely rejuvenated and incredibly fulfilled spirit guiding my every professional decision. I had finally managed to completely shed the suffocating burden of those highly toxic familial relationships that had actively held me back and constantly drained my emotional reserves for so many miserable years. Before wrapping up today's incredibly dramatic episode, please do not click away just yet, because there are some deeply valuable lessons we must discuss regarding this complicated family dynamic. That Sabrina's magnificent journey perfectly illustrates the severe emotional and financial dangers of constantly tolerating toxic favoritism within our own households. Her story serves as a highly powerful reminder that endlessly enduring constant disrespect is absolutely never a strict requirement for maintaining familial bonds, especially when those particular relatives view you strictly as a disposable financial resource. We must always remember that establishing absolute boundaries and prioritizing our own mental well-being is completely necessary when actively dealing with deeply manipulative people who constantly drain our personal energy for their own selfish gain. Preston's ultimate and thoroughly deserved downfall perfectly demonstrates that extreme arrogance and unearned entitlement will eventually lead to complete destruction when reality finally catches up to carefully constructed illusions. I would absolutely love to hear your personal thoughts regarding Sabrina's completely ruthless but entirely justified method of seeking total corporate retribution against her highly toxic relatives. If you were placed in her exact position during that lavish anniversary party, would you have executed the same exact financial takeover to teach them a lesson, or would you have chosen a completely different path toward a peaceful resolution? Please share your unique perspectives and personal stories down in the comment section below,